Good morning to everybody. Mazarin Geopolitics from Italy. Today we made an unplanned stream because we had a chance to have Jason Jay Smart from Ukraine last second yesterday. So thanks to Jason to be with us. I made a super fast presentation and then I will give him directly the stand for making his point about the actual geopolitical situation. So he's a special correspondent like for KyivPost and also a political advisor who had lived and worked in Ukraine, Moldova, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Russia, and through Latin America. And he worked also with a democratic opposition in Russia. Smart was persona not grata for life by Russia in 2010. Despite this, his collaboration with the Russian opposition continue to this day. Earlier, Smart was working in the U.S. politics, including the presidential campaign of Senator John McCain. So, thank you, Jason, to be with us, and I will listen your speech. And for the public, just remember to subscribe to the channel, put the like to the video, and put every question that you want in the chat, and I will read for you to Jason after. Thanks a lot, Jason.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So, I mean, in brief, what I thought would be interesting to discuss today is what does it look like after the war in Ukraine? I mean, I live in Kyiv, this is true, but my academic background is studying the former Soviet states, specifically Russia. So I am a person who has spent a lot of years, I lived in Russia as well before, but I've studied Russia and the political structures of Russia. So the question that I thought would be interesting for this morning is what will happen after Russia finishes losing in Ukraine, which seems inevitable at this point. Just in the past few weeks, we've seen a lot of signs, though, that geopolitically, and that's my emphasis today, is geopolitics of what the fall would signify, is that there would be a lot of changes globally. So let's start off with that. I think that the first thing that I think would be sort of interesting to talk about is that, so after Russia loses, currently Russia is doing very badly in Ukraine. It's lost more than 55,000 soldiers. It's lost a significant amount of its artillery as well as its tanks. And it's really left with very few ballistic missiles. It's left with very few smart bombs. They're left now in a situation of being truly deprived. How deprived? So bad that Russia has put out an order to all pilots in the country, civilian pilots, not even military pilots, that they should use the brakes on the airplane to brake less often, because they simply have no means of replacing the brakes because those were imported before the war. Likewise, lack of microchips makes the building of new smart bombs impossible. Russia technologically is returning to an earlier century due to the grave mistake of entering into Ukraine. So what we see, though, is that there's going to be a few things that happen. I think immediately in the near future, there is a reasonable chance that we see significant instability within Russia. Just an hour ago, I read that someone from the Duma, the parliament of Russia, made an announcement that they had to step up or increase the amount of security at the military recruitment offices. Why? Because there's been so many attacks on them. People have thrown Molotov cocktails in their windows. This morning, the local head of one of the military recruitment offices in Russia was found dead. His body was hanging on a fence. There's been increasing signs that people are rejecting the war and turning against it. Specifically, we see this rejection coming very strongly in areas such as Dagestan, Chechnya. We see in Buryatia. These are areas that are ethnic minority areas. So despite the idea that many people have that Russia is monolithic and ethnically Russian and Orthodox, that's incorrect. People that are being drafted to war 10 times higher than ethnic Russians, or Muscovites, I should say, are people from places such as Dagestan. They are dying in huge numbers. Dagestan is ethnically not Russian. Their primary religion is Islam. And because they are a minority group and they can be overlooked, there is a sense, and it is accurate, that Russia is recruiting them at higher rates because the loss of their lives is less valuable than the loss of ethnic Russians. And so this obvious terrible system that Russia has is creating a lot of tension. And that's what we saw today in Tajikistan. I guess it was last night or this morning. Tajikistan President Tajikistan said to Putin publicly, why is this? We demand respect. We've been partners. We are partner nations. We are not subordinate nations. We've seen the case of Kazakhstan, a country that's always been close to Russia, and a country that's had historically been dominantly Russian-speaking, is changing quickly. The president of Kazakhstan said on a stage in St. Petersburg just a couple months ago, sitting next to Putin publicly, that they did not plan to recognize the Donetsk People's Republic or Lugansk People's Republic or any of these things. It was a public rebuke of Putin. In the case of other countries in the region, we see that Kyrgyzstan is not willing to participate in the collective security trainings that Russia had planned. Russia has its own equivalent of NATO, and Kyrgyzstan was supposed to sponsor those trainings this year. And they last week or week before pulled out, said we no longer wish to participate in that. Armenia says they are not depending anymore on Russia to help them. They did ask for help from the collective security agreement, and it was not provided to them. We see that for Russia, though, it is weakening. Its grasp in the entire region is weakening. And what that's going to do is set off a lot of different things. I mean, obviously, you'll see, as we do see now, a renaissance, let's say, of local indigenous languages. So whether it's Ukrainian, whether it's Kazakh or Kyrgyz, these languages are increasing. And the degree of sentimental tie to Russia is in strong decrease. And this has been building up for a lot of years. This is not something that just happened. But with the rise of Russia using ethnic minorities as the preferred cannon fodder, the preferred victims to die in the war in Ukraine, cities such as Moscow and St. Petersburg are ripe for serious protest and serious instability. Tajikistan, there's an estimated 2 million ethnic Tajiks that live inside of Russia. There's about estimated 1 million Kyrgyz. Kyrgyzstan's only country of about 4 million people. So 1 million of them living in Russia is a lot. But those people are unhappy. They realize that Russians do not appreciate them, do not respect them. And the chance that creates more instability is high. So what I imagine would happen after the fall or before even the loss of the war in Ukraine is I think that Putin will fall. And Putin will probably fall due to his own inner circle, either killing him or replacing him through some other means. But what will happen next is that we see that in Russian society as a whole, there's an increase of dissatisfaction. The passive nature that had earlier accompanied the Putin years, where he was sure that he had everything under control, is disappearing. It's increasingly clear that things are not under control. The economy is not under control. The society is not under control. And this is something that's the first time this happened in Russia since 1991, for sure. The 90s were unstable, but they had probably more signs of stability than today, I would argue. And we're seeing it slip get out of control. In the case of for instance, the soldiers being now sent, 200,000 soldiers Putin has called up in Russia, reservists. Many of them have had less than 2 or 3 days of training before being sent to Ukraine. Some of them without arms, without any sort of firearms, are being sent to Ukraine. And some of the firearms are being sent, if you see what's online, publicly available from Russian news, they're being issued weapons that are produced in World War II. I mean, 80-year-old rifles. So this is a significant setback for the country. But what that means in the grand scheme, okay, so Russia's very weak. Putin is very weak. The chance of Putin being killed or removed is, I think, increasingly high. What would happen, though, what are the ripples? And so that's actually sort of the essence of my talk, though I wanted to give the other background, is that I think that there's a few things that we could expect. And we'll go around the world place by place. So I wanted to start actually with Central Asia, because that's the one that's most in the news today due to the Tajik president quite openly rebuking Putin and Russian chauvinism, which historically has been a problem for Russia. Joseph Stalin actually wrote a significant amount about this. What is Russian chauvinism and how it's a problem for the Soviet experiment? And so when we look at today with this Russian chauvinism, people have had enough. And this younger generation, especially Central Asia, has a higher birth rate, so a younger population that has no ties to the Soviet Union, that doesn't remember the Soviet Union, and so there's no affinity to it, doesn't really understand why Russian language or Russian culture should be dominant over their language or their culture. And so I think we will see a rise of things, namely the country of Turkey will benefit the most from this. Why Turkey? So much of Central Asia, not Tajikistan, but the other republics, are Turkic. Their languages are Turkic-based. They are the same religion. Turkey has significant economic ties to the region and influence. More than that, Turkey can provide security in the region, unlike other countries. China is the dominant threat in Central Asia in the eyes of most people. And so Turkey would be sort of the balance to that. And this has been something that Erdogan has been pushing for years, is to build up this Turkish influence. And I think that's going to be a significant move, the rise of Turkey in the region. And we've seen Turkey's backing of Azerbaijan recently with the conflict of Armenia as significant. Turkey's role will increase as Russia decreases. Turkey is actually probably a healthy, I would imagine, largely healthy influence in the region for a lot of reasons. One, due to the economics of it. Second, due to the pushing of education, the positive view it has of education. And also, I think that the collective security that could provide against radicalism. Turkey is known for not wanting to have radical religious movements that create terrorism, for instance. So it could sort of have a positive effect there. Now, in terms of what would happen in, let's say, China. Well, China is next door. So I think China is looking at the situation, looking at the decline of Putin. It's learning a lot. It certainly has its ambitions still for Taiwan, but I think it's learned watching Russia's disastrous invasion of Ukraine that perhaps it's not worth it. I mean, if something like that happens and you get on the world stage and attack a country against the entire world's screams, what happens if you fail? Your country becomes destroyed. And I think the Chinese understand that, and they're learning a lot. They're seeing the value, for instance, of drone warfare versus man-based troops taking the territories. They are seeing what Russia is doing well, what Russia is doing bad. But more importantly, they're seeing that Russia is the weakest it's been in decades. And so this is an opportunity for China. If we know China, we look at how China has dealt with other countries, Central Asia included, Africa included, Latin America included. China has always put an angle on economic interest. And so I think China right now, because China is very smart and they are very strategic, I think, in their foreign policy, I think that they will be investing heavily in ways that does not violate sanctions, investing heavily in Russia, buying out industries, buying out buildings, buying out things that can be very, very, very cheap. Because ultimately, no matter what happens to Russia, it will remain the neighbor of China. And so buying out their industries, buying out their strategic areas or strategic businesses is something that China is a good bet for its future, to be able to still have a lot of influence in the country and to dominate what happens there. So I think China is going to be one of the big winners of the decline of Russia. But you might think, well, okay, so this is all very regional. But in fact, I would argue it's not. I think that what we will see, though, with the decline of Putin's Russia, specifically Putin's Russia, is the rise of things, specifically in Latin America. I'll start with that one, is that Latin America, I think we'll see that there's the use of Russia Today. Russia Today's television programming and other Russian government paid for, backed television programming and other propaganda is very influential, extremely influential. And it's sort of interesting is that the general perspective, if you ask people, which I have, is that it's not different than watching BBC. They don't view Russia Today as being any different than BBC, which is sort of funny because they're nothing alike. But at the same time, there's a perspective. Now, if Russia Today stopped broadcasting and you stopped having this slanted worldview that's opposed to for instance, close relations with the United States, I think that the natural ties of Latin America will shift more in a pro-U.S. direction. I also think that Russia, the FBI announced 2 months ago, the FBI announced that it was investigating how Russia had been financing political parties in Latin America, in Asia, and in Africa. And I think there's a lot of left movements specifically in Latin America that may have ties to Russia or Russian financing. And without that financing, the ability to win elections will become much less. So I think major countries in Latin America that have shifted left historically will have trouble coming to win elections again in the future without significant financing. And I don't know where else they would get that from, except for Russia, because the rightist political parties are generally supported by the business community, by banking, and things like that. So the leftist parties don't have that sort of support. Now, if we look at the three major dictatorships in Latin America, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, I think that'll also be interesting. I think Venezuela is most likely going to, before any of the other ones, is going to turn in a direction that's, let's say, neutral to positive towards the U.S. And the reason is going to be simple. I think that there's a very high probability that the government will fall. Currently, there's Russian advisors helping Maduro to keep power in the country. Without them, I don't think he'll have the ability to do so. But secondly, I think that we've seen recent moves in Venezuela. For instance, they recently cooperated with the United States in extraditing someone from Venezuela to the United States. We see that Maduro, the vote in the United Nations just a couple of days ago, look how Venezuela voted regarding Russia's absorption of the territories of Ukraine. So we see that there's something going on there. We see that the Venezuelans realize this acrimonious relationship with the Americans isn't helpful, and it's better to sell oil to the Americans. So I think they are trying to find a way to do that. They're in a very difficult spot. It won't be fast, but without Russia's support, I don't see how Maduro can resist the need to do this. In the case of Nicaragua, it's a country for decades. It's had lots of problems. But, without Russia's support, again, I think the military support from Russia has always been significant, and it would make things much harder for them to keep control. And in the case of Cuba, finally, Cuba, along with Bolivia and other countries in the region, is engaged in things such as the drug trade, illegal drug trade. And so I think these countries, once again, which are reliant on Russia, but also on Iran, it's important to note here Iran, another major partner of Russia, it'll be much harder for them to be able to keep their lock on those countries, much harder for them to be able to stay in power. And I think that there's a very good chance that we will see a decline of a couple secondary effects. We'll see a decline of, obviously, Russia's influence, the rise of right-leaning parties, pro-business parties, pro-American parties. But more than that, I think we'll see a decline of violence in Mexico. And why is that? I think we'll see a decline in the drug trade. And if we see a decline in the drug trade, and why the drug trade? Because that's not often in the press. So because Russia, like Iran, like Venezuela, is sanctioned, they have no access to dollars. They do have euros, but it's also a difficult thing to get those. It's better to have something, a commodity that you can trade, something that has a value. So guns have a value everywhere in the world. There's always a market in every country to sell guns if you want to sell a gun. But drugs, there's absolutely always a market. So if you trade in drugs, you can get around not having liquidity. Because if I introduce a drug to a foreign country and I sell it in the streets, I will then have currency from that country. So it fixes part of my problem. And so I think the decline of the drug trade, which is being used to wash money for terrorists and wash money or be used by terrorist organizations to make money, I think this will be a significant change in the whole stability of the region once the drug trade is in decline or damaged. Likewise, I think in the case of Africa, I think that there's a very good chance that we'll see a shift more in the direction of stability, specifically in not all countries, but the ones where Russia is active, where it has been sending Wagner Group, which is a mercenary groups with the backing of the Kremlin, to these countries to upset the political leadership or to stabilize the political leadership. That won't exist anymore. So the natural ends of whatever was going on in these countries will continue without Russia's role. But once again, the big winner here, I would argue, is likely going to be China. China's invested very heavily in Africa. And now without Russia getting in the way, the Americans aren't involved, the Europeans aren't very involved in Africa. China is much more directly involved. And I think that this will be an end-all gain for China. Now, when we talk about what happens next, so all these countries are going about and they start to decline. Who else then is going to take the role of Russia? I mean, what else is there? What other competitors, let's say, of Russia are there? And I think that the major one is Iran. The Iranian Republic, as we see right now, is having significant problems. Protests are ongoing, the most significant protests since 1979. And the chance that the government falls is significant. I see that the protests just this morning, I was looking at various videos of the protests in Iran, are becoming increasingly violent. I mean, extremely violent. And I think this is a sign that the state is losing the monopoly of force, the monopoly of violence, which is, as you know, one of the attributes of what a government has is the monopoly of violence, the ability to be the only one using violence in society and meting out justice as such. And I think that this is a sign that Iran is very weak. Now, if Iran were to fall, that would change the whole region again. This becomes much more complicated in a good way. It's not a bad thing. If Iran falls, it would be fantastic. But the fact is that Russia right now is very dependent on Iran. Look at the drones. The drones are being used right now in Ukraine, today as we speak, by Russia are coming from Iran. Iran is providing these drones. Without them, Russia would be even worse off than it is now because it doesn't have its own. If we look at the drones that Russia is using currently, it's I would say it's comical, but it's a war, so I don't wish to say it's comical, but it's absurd. I mean, I saw just yesterday one that they crashed, and the gasoline, or the I should say, yes, I guess it was gasoline powered, if I recall. The top for it had gotten lost, and they had no replacement top. So there's a Coca-Cola bottle top which had been screwed onto it to make the thing work. I mean, Russia is just technologically destroyed. I mean, an airplane or a helicopter crashed a little while ago, and they opened the cockpit and they found that they had a GPS, the type that people used to hold in their hands 15 years ago. It was taped to the dashboard of the cockpit, and that's what the pilot depended on because they don't have their own navigation systems. So without Iran's technological assistance at this point, things become increasingly difficult for Russia. And I think that it's to the great shock of Russia, actually, that China has not been willing to help out. And I think that was a very easy economic decision for China. That was not about ideological reasons that they're very sympathetic to the United States or to Europe or to Ukraine, for sure. I think it's much more pragmatic. Simply, what percent of China's trade is with the United States and the European Union versus how much of it is with Russia? The Russian economy, as we know, is extremely small, and today even smaller. It's a country that has no ability to it doesn't really produce very much. I mean, it's mostly the export of gas, oil is a significant part of the economy. But when you think about it, what else do you buy from Russia? What goods do you buy? I mean, is there milk that you buy from Russia? Is there tables that you buy from Russia? Is there refrigerators you buy from Russia? Is there cars you buy from Russia? What do you actually buy from Russia? And there's very, very little. And so Russia's ability now, especially now that the war has begun and it can't get new goods, it's become increasingly difficult for Russia to be able to keep its economy operating. And we will see this decline of the economy in the near future. And I think it's only going to get worse. It's not going to get better. But what that also means, though, for regional European security, so I'll end with Europe because we're talking with Europeans, is I think that we'll see a shift in the direction of Ukraine. And I don't say that because I'm favorable to Ukraine. I sincerely do believe that Ukraine will have a lot more regional as well as European power than it did before. Influence is the word I'm looking for. And the reason for that is simple, is that due to this war, which has cost a lot of Ukrainian lives, we don't know how many. It's probably in the range of 50,000 military lives plus thousands more of civilian lives. It's going to be, it has all the abilities now to become a very strong country. Keep in mind, the population of Ukraine is about 40 million, which is the same as Poland. Poland's about 40 million. The difference, though, is that Poland has a GDP of just a little bit less than $600 billion. Ukraine, by comparison, it's $155 billion. Yet Ukraine has wonderful land for agriculture, has a huge amount of opportunity for production, and has a lot of opportunities. So, and it's cheaper than Poland, cheaper than European countries. But historically, the problem was corruption. Corruption has been always the crux of the problem for Ukraine. And I think, though, after this war, it'll be harder, and I'm most certain this corruption systematized corruption, will be in decline. The population, I don't believe, will tolerate it anymore. I've seen a real shift in the way that people think, what they believe. And I think that the chance that Ukraine will become a serious opportunity for investment, especially for Europeans, will increase dramatically. And when the threat of Russia is removed, it then becomes a much better investment. I mean, I would understand a year ago why somebody in Europe would not want to build a factory in Ukraine, because there's a risk of war, which there is. But after the war, that will go away. And so all of a sudden, Ukraine will become much more interesting to investors and to others seeking to develop. I think that the other major roadblock for Ukraine, which must overcome, is the oligarchs. There are oligarchs in this country who have a lot of control and a lot of financial power. And it is not impossible to break them as a system, but if they are broken, and there's really nothing that stands in the way of Ukraine becoming a dominant feature a significant feature in the European stage that will be able to really, I think, even balance out the power that's coming from other countries, such as namely Germany and France. Just the populations between Ukraine and Poland combined, and looking at the economic growth that they've experienced, I think there's a very good chance that Ukraine could be a significant player in the European context as well. So that's about all I was going to say this morning.
Perfect. Thank you, Jason. I collected some question in advance and also during the live. So the first one is connected to an interview that I did yesterday from a political analyst. She's Ukrainian, but she's based in London now. Aliona Ivko, a Ukrainian political analyst now in London, predict a conflict that will last until next summer, minimum, with a possible Russian counteroffensive in the spring. So, how long do you think the conflict on the ground in Ukraine will last? What could be the game changer of the conflict?
It's very hard to say. And I don't even know how people make these predictions because it depends on a lot of variables we simply don't know. It depends on what Putin does. But I think that there is a significant chance that Putin will launch another invasion again, a last chance to try to win the war. For his great misfortune and the great fortune of Ukraine, his military is terrible. And so I think that an invasion coming from the north to the south, that is from Belarus to Kiev, is probably going to happen at some point. That'll be his last ability or his last chance to be able to try to take Kiev. But at that point, that will use up probably the rest of their military. They won't have a lot of ballistic missiles left. They will lose a lot of soldiers doing that. And thereafter, his military is going to be pretty much destroyed. I don't know how they could continue from there. But it all depends on what Putin decides to do.
And connected to this thing about missiles, Charles Cavet is like a viewer. What sources are you citing for the claim that Russia is running out of missiles?
Oh, we know how many ballistic missiles they have, so we can count how many have been shot. I mean, it's not complicated. We have an agreement with them about ballistic missiles, so it's calculable. No, they're losing quickly, yeah. And the fact is that's one of the mistakes that Russia made, a significant mistake, was in the initial invasion because they thought it was going to be very short, like 3 days. They used up tons. I mean, if you look at the first 3 days, the rate that they were burning through their supplies was amazing, and they were really using them quickly. Now, this stage is just simply a lot less, and that's why it's very uncommon. I mean, Kiev, the air raid sirens in Kiev, have only been a couple times in the last months. Well, it's not true. They do happen quite often. How often do missiles actually strike Kiev? One this past Monday, and it was a few months before then. It doesn't happen often anymore because Russia simply doesn't have enough to just keep doing what it was doing before.
Connected to this one, could the recent missile strikes be a form of weakness, such as a Russia change of military strategy? We are not winning on the field, so we need to show up to the internal audience in Russia, but we're still have any chance to win.
Well, I mean, I think that, yeah, there's always a domestic audience angle to this, but I think that there's another more logical reason that Russia chose this attacks on Monday, which was they were trying to strike the energy stations, that is where the energy is produced, hoping that they could knock out the electricity because that would obviously paralyze Ukraine, and try to knock out the internet as well. Obviously, they were not successful in either case. But there was, power losses for a few hours in different cities, but it's all come back now. The reality is that Russia is very ineffective. And actually, to have such an ineffective attack as they did on Monday, they lost the Crimean Bridge, which is worth, I think, $5 billion construction, if I recall correctly. Well, it's not totally lost. It's part of it's still there. But to have that significant of a loss, and all they can do is fire, 71 missiles into Ukraine, of which 42 were intercepted by Ukraine's anti-air systems. It's a pretty bad result for Russia.
Okay, this one is still connected to, let's say, to the previous part of the war. What can be a compromise on both sides to reach a ceasefire and a peace treaty? Why I'm asking this one? Because, for example, in the Italian press, everybody is trying to pushing for a ceasefire before the winter. So what do you think that could be a compromise between the two parts?
I don't see any desire on the part of the Ukrainians for negotiations. I mean, I see absolutely no interest whatsoever. I mean, absolutely none. And there'll be a ceasefire once Russia surrenders all the occupied territories. I mean, I think it's less than a 0% chance that Ukraine will be willing to negotiate.
Yeah, it was like Alyona Ilvok yesterday said the same, like the compromise, but it's difficult for me to, let's say, understand by the Russian mentality, but the Russian mentality, like the way how they can sell this in the internal audience. Let's say
I think Putin will say to his public that it wasn't them that lost, rather it was NATO that defeated them. He would blame it on NATO. That's significant.
Okay.
He would not say they lost. He would say, or that the Ukrainians won. He certainly wouldn't say that. No, he'll say that it was NATO teamed up and all the NATO countries were fighting them together against Russia. And this is what happened. That's why Russia needs to rebuild and things like this. But he would never admit what actually happened.
Okay, another one on the topic of after the war. As you say that Russia is about to become unstable. How do you know that China will not intervene as they intervened in the Korean War due to the potential instability of the region?
I don't think it would lose regional stability. I mean, I think it would be fine for China. It's a positive, not a minus. It's what does China lose in this? China right now is in a situation where they have the largest country next to them is not able to do business. It's frozen. It's not helpful to them, this current situation. And it's not been a really reliable partner. The reality is that Russia is not a great partner for China. It would probably try to control what happens there so it could sort of have influence in whoever comes next. That's probable. But I don't think they would try to stop the breakup. No, I don't see that.
Connected to this one, do you think that China has strategically given partial support to Russia, like let's say to be with abstention in the UN Security Council instead to be against to secure low cost energy access in the post conflict?
I think that China is always looking at for low energy. That's definitely the case. The fact is though that China is also able to get that. And without offering very much to Russia. The fact is that Russia needs cash as bad as it can. You don't really need to offer very much even additional benefits. You just have to say, sure, here it is. Here's the oil, give me the cash. And that's really what Russia needs. Any other sort of political deal is unnecessary from both parts.
If I can show to you like this, it's like the gas situation updates. It's only for you because like in the Russian media they are saying we are not selling gas anymore to Europe. We will freeze or whatever. This was like the post the map of the former the Gazprom pipelines. And actually, Italy was importing 40% of its gas from Russia. Now it's less than 8%, I think, from Tarvisio, from Austria. And it's very interesting for me that public didn't see that we have alternative sources. I think that the weak country, it's Germany, not Italy, because we can take the gas from the south, like this one. And in your opinion, what could be like the last declaration of Putin after the meeting with Erdogan that said that Turkey could be the next gas hub for Europe instead of Germany after the war? Because like Turkey is in this like strategical position, for example, to connect also Azerbaijan. And now there is also talking about the new Cyprus gas field. Under Cyprus, there is a new agreement between Cyprus, Israel, Egypt, and Italy to connect this huge gas field to Southern Europe. Do you think that they are already searching a different road for the gas instead of Germany through Turkey?
Yeah, sure, definitely. I mean, I have no doubt that they are. I mean, the fact is that Turkey is also trying with these new initiatives, such as the new Silk Road, where you could have trade transporting just exactly where those gas lines you just showed on the map are, but continuing all the way through Central Asia for just normal trade, where you could then bypass having to go through Russia to go directly from China to Europe. this is another initiative. I mean, Turkey is definitely a major regional player, and I think it's actually one of the most interesting countries in the region to watch because its influence there is so significant and so rarely reported really in the press.
This is very interesting point for me because I made a speech with one of my favorite American author that it's called Steve Levine, that made a book that it's called The Oil and the Glory. I don't know if you ever read about it, about like what was happening during the collapse of the Soviet Union around the Caspian Sea. And for me, it's still interesting that the Russian strategy during the Soviet Union was that all the gas had to pass from the republics to Russia and then outside the Soviet Union. And it was like an offense, for example, the pipeline, the TAP, that it's going Baku, Georgia, Turkey, Italy, Greece, Albania, Italy. And also the huge Turkmenistan gas fields that maybe passing through the Caspian could be connected to Europe without passing. It's very interesting that the West, except maybe US, is not very focused on Central Asia because there is a lot of interesting things there. Connected to this one, Erdogan's declaration after the UN Assembly in September said things that Russia should return all territories to Ukraine, referring not only the territories occupied since February 24, but also Crimea. What do you think about this declaration? Why it's not clear to me the Turkey's position because it's a little bit like one fit to shoes. Like I'm supporting Ukraine, but I want to make still business with Russia. I'm giving Bayraktar to Ukraine, but I want to make pipeline with Russia.
I mean, I think that I think Turkey's smart. They understand the fact that there's really no future with Russia. There's things they want to get out of Russia, like money, but they don't really want to build a strategic relationship. The fact is, it's a country in decline. And there's nothing to gain by being a partner of Russia at this point. They can't offer you anything. They can't give you money. They can't give you contracts. There's no point in having them. Their military is definitely not going to defend you. If they can't defend Armenia, for God's sake, they can't even take villages in Ukraine. How are they going to defend a foreign country? It's impossible. And so I think that Turkey understands that, yes, there is some economic potential stuff for themselves, but they realize that ultimately Russia is not any sort of benefits to themselves.
In the case of Armenia, one question from the public. On the current Armenia crisis, has Ukraine taken a position as Armenia to has its border invaded by Azerbaijan? Because I read news, but very old, of 2011, where like the former government was, let's say, taking a stand for Azerbaijan in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Do you know if there is like any position of the actual government?
It's a good question. And to be really honest with you, I'm not sure. I don't remember what the position. I mean, I would assume that they're supporting Armenia given the situation, but I frankly don't know, so I don't want to comment.
Okay. Now it's interesting for me because when you said that Armenia asked the help with Article 4 of the organization, like the security organization of the former Soviet Union republics, and Russia said no. And I found a lot of very interesting data that India is starting to providing weapons to Armenia. Because Azerbaijan has a political support to Pakistan. So India is like technically offering weapon and help in a contraposition of the support of Azerbaijan to Pakistan. It's very complicated area, because it's
I totally agree. Yeah, it's very complicated.
I have like last 3-4 questions for you.
Okay.
So, in your opinion about Iran falling, what is your opinion about Saudi Arabia's future, especially when their biggest geopolitical rivals falls?
Sorry, I had to reread the question. So I think obviously Saudi Arabia is a fascinating country. It's got a lot of power and influence in the region. But I think that Saudi Arabia is always been worried about Iran. And if it does fall, they would definitely use their influence there to try to establish a pro-European, a pro-Western, let's call it, government, because that would align with their own interest. It wouldn't be a government subservient, obviously, to Saudi Arabia, but I think that would be more on the track of not what current Iran is, because it's simply not in their interest to have a country that's a threat. Same with Israel. I mean, there's nobody who's benefiting from Iran being the theocracy that it is. Everybody benefits from a normal democratic country, which is, I think, in the case of Iran, very realistic. I mean, Russia, if it becomes democratic, is a much more challenging question. But in the case of Iran, there's all indications it's more likely to become a democratic country if the regime falls.
Okay. The last question from the public, and then I have the last 2-3 questions that are connected just to close the speech. In your view, that the world is getting overall better, how does Palestine fit into your worldview in the event both Iran and Russia falls?
That's an interesting question. If Iran and Russia fall, what happens? That's a very good question. I'm not quite sure. I never thought about Palestine in the context of what would happen if Russia and Iran fell. I would imagine in the long term, I'm not certain, is that I think in the long term, the country, Palestine will develop. It will become normalized. And I think that there will be eventually, most likely, a two-state solution. But I don't know how that would happen, how it would be affected. I'd have to read more about it, to be honest. But it's a very good question, very provocative.
That's interesting because the two-state question and solution was said by the actual prime minister at the UN assembly, but also inside the same government there is not an agreement about it. So I was talking with Emmanuel Navon, that is a professor of the University of Tel Aviv. And he said that it's like internal Israeli politics, like to make a little bit of mess about, let's say, anything that is connected to the two states solution. Okay. So the last thing about internal Russia, and then how do you see the possible succession of the Russian president as an internal change, like inside his circle? Or can someone from the extra parliamentary opposition come to the fore?
I mean, I think it depends, but because once again, it's not going to be a democratic change of government in Russia, so it's hard to say. It's not like predicting elections, because I don't know who's going to kill Putin. It could have happened 10 minutes ago. We just don't know yet. So who would kill him and then seize power? Well, so historically, it's important to note that there's two major powers in Russia, which is the intelligence service and the military, and they're competing with each other always. They hate each other. And so Putin has always, as a policy, had them sort of fight with each other. He likes that because it gives him control. He's the mediator between them both. And they tell on each other, they inform on each other. And so he's the moderator between them both. And this is something he's been doing the whole time as president. So what we see today, though, is that before the invasion, the military was on the better side, the more favored side of Putin. Now, given the disaster that the Russian military has become, it seems the intelligence people are more on the favorable side. So a lot of the people would say that the most likely person to take power in Russia, should something happen, is the current head of the FSB.
FSB.
Yes. Of course, I forget his name right now, and I can imagine his face perfectly. I just can't remember his name. I apologize. But when I think that it's very likely that he would come to power. He's an old friend of Putin. They worked together since the 1970s, but still he's stable. He's been in intelligence for a long time. He's not particularly intelligent, but he would be, enough to keep things going. Now, if there is a change, though, that's not democratic, that is, someone kills Putin, there is a very good chance that they would kill a lot of the leadership in the country as well, to make sure that that would not happen. And so I think if that were to happen, if Russia were to transition, it would not be a democracy initially. I'm quite sure of that. I think that there's a very good chance that people would take power and create, let's say, a caretaker government until there was an election. They would probably have to arrest a lot of people and detain a lot of people to prevent those who are currently in power from remaining in power. It's going to be, I think, it's a very high probability that it would be a very bloody and dangerous period of time. But I think that there is, yes, a very good chance for the Russian opposition. There's a lot of Russian opposition and growing, but there's a very good chance that they could come to power just simply given the fact that they're well known in the population. And I think it'd be very easy for the population of Russia to understand that, here's Putin and these guys are his opponents, and that's why they came to power and there's no longer Putin. though they're not very popular. None of them have very high polling numbers. None of them. That being said, I think for the population as a whole, it would be a logical change to have the people who are currently in opposition take power.
Okay, vision about the election, and then I have a last geopolitical question. Do you think that the upcoming election in Brazil, China, and the midterm of the United States could change the balance of the war in Ukraine and the world order?
I don't think the elections in Brazil will change the balance of power. They're going to be very interesting, of course, but I don't think it should change the balance of power. Right? Brazil has gone left and right before between Lula and Bolsonaro, and I don't think that it's really shifted anything that's going on. And regionally, I think it was definitely a gain for the left having Lula come to power. When he got out of prison, I saw the joy that brought. But I don't think anything that really strategically changed the region. Now, in the case of what's going to happen next, I think that for China, they will continue to grow, but I think that China has a ceiling. I don't think China is going to take over the world for a lot of reasons. But one is due to the fact that its internal structure is very chaotic and under control. I think it's going to be very difficult for Russia to systemically continue to grow, given a lot
China.
of China. Sorry, I said China, due to the fact that it has enough internal problems. But I think it's possible, but I just think it's improbable.
Okay. Last question, more complicated. What do you think about the vision of a multipolar system proposed several times by Russian President Putin? Let's say I listen more from Dugin, but let's say by Putin, as opposed as the current American traction system.
It's sort of funny is I honestly, sincerely believe that the U.S. system was in decline until this war. I think it's been the greatest benefit to the U.S. having a unipolar world in a long time. I mean, the fact is, I think this is going to bring a lot of the countries, as we point out, Latin America, going in the direction of the U.S. I think in the case of Europe, it's become very clear that U.S. security is the central part of European security. U.S.'s military is what is backing security in Europe. And I think that's clear for the Central Asian republics as well, who hate China, but they realize that going in the direction, where can they go? They can't go to Russia. They can't go to China. But they can go to Turkey, which is a NATO country as well. This also benefits the U.S. I think in the case of what we see in just as a whole, the U.S. is in ascendancy right now. And it's something I frankly did not anticipate. I really did think that had Putin not invaded, there perhaps would have been a different world, but he's completely lost it. And I think the chance of a multipolar world, like he envisioned, will never happen.
Okay, perfect. So, thank you for your time and for your answer. I think it was very, very interesting. So, if everybody will see the video later and you want to make any type of comments, question, please put in the comments under the video. Put the like and subscribe to the channel. I hope that we could have also Jason Jay when we will organize the geopolitical school next year. Thank you for viewing our speech, and thank you, Jesus, for your time, and see you in the next stream.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.